In order for me to successfully yassify suffering for you, we must first define our terms. According to an adept definition submitted by Obama's $1 Million Puthe on urbandictionary.com, yassification is the process of making something substantially better than its original version. Take, for example, this yassified Walter White. Appropriately, the first definition for suffering on Urban Dictionary by that W dude is simply this: humanity. Example: my life is never-ending suffering. That W dude is not wrong, especially if you were to consult with many great philosophers, including Friedrich Nietzsche, Viktor Frankl, and Marcus Aurelius. Life is suffering. It is unavoidable. However, the purpose of this video is not to convince you of the existence of suffering. I expect you are familiar with that. Maybe you're suffering with something right now. Rather, my purpose is to remind you that while life is suffering, suffering gives meaning to life. Today's society has conditioned us to shy away from and resist suffering, but we must instead embrace it. Let me explain. Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher and cultural critic of the late 1800s, asserted that humans are made up of two parts: the creative part, our mind, and the created part, our body. The body is meant to suffer, and the mind is meant to create something beautiful out of that suffering. Thus, in man, creature and creator are united. He says, "In man there is material, fragment, excess, clay, dirt, nonsense, chaos. But there is also the creator, the sculptor, the hardness of the hammer, the divinity of the spectator, and the seventh day. Do you understand this contrast? The body must be fashioned, bruised, forged, stretched, roasted, and refined. It is meant to suffer." This theory's credibility is evidenced by the physical practice of fitness. We must master the discipline of suffering as a means to a better future, improved health, wellness, and beauty. Nietzsche asks, "Do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far?" To abolish suffering would lead to a complacent life headed towards destruction. The greater the suffering, the greater the achievement. Perhaps no culture is more intimately familiar with suffering than the Jews. The ancient Jews address suffering in the book of Job, which explores the problem of theodicy, a way to vindicate God and answer the question of why God permits evil. Job, a pious, wealthy, devout servant of God, is tested because Satan predicts that if Job were stripped of his family and affluence, he would abandon his devotion to God. While the book of Job leaves much open to interpretation, Job does conclude that though he slay me, yet I will trust in him, demonstrating that piety must be unselfish. If ultimate evil exists, so must ultimate good. Job decides that while he does not understand the misfortunes that befall him, he will stay resolute in his faith. The book of Job represents a largely celebrated piece of the Old Testament that works to answer one of the most burning questions of mankind: why do we suffer? It's hard to think of senseless suffering without thinking of the horrors we saw in World War II. The work of Austrian neurologist and philosopher Viktor Frankl, who was influenced by Nietzsche, lends the unique perspective of a studied mind coupled with intense personal experience. Shortly after Frankl's marriage in 1941, his new bride and unborn child died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Later, his father would die in Theresienstadt concentration camp, and his mother and brother would both die at Auschwitz, where Frankl himself spent 3 years. Following his liberation, Frankl would write his most popular book, Man's Search for Meaning, in just 9 days. The book introduced Frankl's 3 basic principles of logotherapy. Life has meaning under all circumstances, even the most miserable ones. Our main motivation for living is to find meaning in life, and that we have freedom to find meaning in what we do and what we experience or at least in the stance we take when faced with a situation of unchangeable suffering. In the book, Frankl also addresses the profound question of how to go about finding meaning with 3 modes of discovery. 1, by creating a work or doing a deed. 2, by experiencing something or encountering someone. And 3, by the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. He contends that the last freedom man has, when everything else is taken, is to choose his attitude. Lastly, though technically firstly, we can look back as early as 160 AD to the meditations of Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius for inspiration to embrace the inevitable suffering of life. His collection of journals, written to himself during his reign, were later published as 12 books of meditations. In regard to suffering, he adopted the strategy of detaching his consciousness from the experiences of his body and mind, allowing him total control over situations in his life, whether particularly good or particularly bad. He says in Book 5, "Let the part of thy soul which leads and governs be undisturbed by the movements in the flesh, whether of pleasure or of pain, and let it not unite with them, but let it circumscribe itself and limit those effects to their parts." He adopts a pain is inevitable, suffering is optional mentality. He says, if it is endurable, then endure it. If it is not endurable, then stop complaining. Your destruct will mean its end as well. He is arguing here that complaining about his situation would be giving in to pain. He would prefer to remain unbothered by his pain, taking solace in the knowledge that if it should kill him, it would also kill the sensation. Whether or not you revere suffering the way these philosophers do, there is no doubt that in our modern world, oftentimes a little suffering is the missing key to a fulfilled life. Most Americans have no need to become intimately familiar with suffering, much less that of a self-imposed nature, because contemporary life has become so effortless for us. We drive instead of walk, sit all day at desks in temperature-controlled environments, have whatever food we want delivered on demand. We have dopamine releasers glued to our hands 24 hours a day, and whenever we need a hit, we just fire up that palm-sized screen and seek out whatever will satisfy our 7-second attention spans. While technology has allowed us to create a world comprised of unlimited instant gratification, it is important to not forget the lessons of our philosophical forefathers. Life is not meant to be easy. You should wish not for a life without suffering, but for the ability to endure suffering of the harshest nature. It is unlikely that we will ever have to suffer the way, for instance, Viktor Frankl did, so it seems like we have little room to complain by Marcus Aurelius' standards. Finding ways to connect yourself with suffering in a meaningful way will make the times of comfort in your life more rewarding. I challenge you to not only endure your suffering, but to yassify it. Make it fashion, make it camp, make it art, make it mean something. Even if the only thing it means is that you are the kind of person who takes pain and creates pleasure. Nothing makes you more godlike.